My name is Nicolas Marty, and I will talk today about my approach of narratology in the study of music reception. First of all, I have to address my position regarding several common questions about music. What is music? Let us consider for the present study only music as any kind of sound organization, whatever the pregnant parameters. To avoid confusion, I will not talk about opera or any kind of vocal music which uses semantic or verbal content. We can then ask ourselves, is music a language or merely a means of communication? Closer to the topic of this paper, can music be a piece of narrative? Coker defines 6 criterion for the existence of a language. The third rule is the most striking in the case of music. If most people are able to interpret musical symbols, be it only because of implicit learning, most of those listeners would be incapable of producing a musical work themselves. There are also the questions of a dictionary and a monemic syntax for music, which I will not linger on. We may agree for the time of this presentation on music in general not being a language. It could still, however, be a means of communication. The concept of communication is treated differently according to the perspectives of the disciplines using it. In sociology, Durkheim considered communication as an interaction in a network where collective representations are shared. Later part interactive sound installation and the like. How could Occidental serious music be considered an interaction? In psychology, communication is considered as the transmission of data from a source to a recipient. If music is to be considered as such, as a means of communication from this point of view, then it would need to be a communication between composer or performer and listener. But music does not intrinsically carry data. However, the listener may find data in the listening experience, which the composer may or may not have put there. Let's agree again, for the time of this presentation, on music not being a means of communication because it needs not be considered as such for now. So a piece of narrative, maybe. The structuralist point of view has been the object of many works. Martha Grabosch, present here, has defined music's narrativity as the mode of organization of signifieds inside a musical work. Even if this model allows for a better understanding of tonal music's form, syntax, and historical poetics, Nattier suggests that narrativity would be better considered here as a metaphor of said form, rather than a characteristic of narrative. He also underlines some of the ambiguity in some Tarastier's analysis. Furthermore, in my point of view, this model is not suitable for sound music. In the structuralist point of view, as well as in several other approaches, music is lent literal narrativity, because it could only evoke it. Musical narrativity, as opposed to music's literary narrativity, would encompass more than just plots, characters, and stories. In my opinion, narrativity needs to be considered solely from the point of view of the listener, because the continuum between the producer, the composer, and the listener because the continuum between producer and receiver, if there is such a thing, does not work in the same way in music as it does with language. Flodenick's natural narratology seemed a good starting point for the development of my model. It included the idea that narrativity relies on experientiality and is imposed on the text by readers in order to make sense of it. But she found her analysis on natural, that is to say for her oral narrative, as the basis for the construction of narrativity. We must thus split apart from the model to be able to study music as more than just the recuperation of narrativity schemas from the use of verbal language. This paper will explore 4 key concepts toward the clarification of my natural narratology for music. First, we'll get into the details of the natural experiential models offered by Flodenick at its most abstract level, and see to what extent it can be applied to music and to what extent it must be adapted to it. Then I will explain the reasons for my use of the literary concept of focalization as the centration of experientiality. I will explore the segmentation of music and the making of ontological entities by the listener. The proposed paradigm for natural narratology is represented by Flodenick in this diagram. It's hers. Flodenick is fully aware of the misleading aspect of the concept of natural, which can be seen and is often used as correlated to innatism or universalism. She does not mean to use it that way, nor do I. But a definition of it, according to which the natural is both a construction in terms of being a reading effect and a pre-given frame of human cognition, this still seems a bit cryptic. Roughly, the natural would rely on human-situated and embodied cognition, and the natural narratology would study narrativity drawing from the point of view of the receiver, the one who conceives it through the lens of his or her experience. Flodenick redefines narrativity as a function of narrative text which centers on experientiality of an anthropomorphic nature. This would allow for the study of plotless events, but even so, the model is attached to narrative texts. We'll have to stray from that path in order to adapt the model to the study of musical narrativity. Flodenick defines narrativization as follows, inspired by Coller's naturalization. It's here. Her use of the concept is different from that of White and Nattier, who described narrativization as the construction of a plot by the reader or listener, what Flodenick calls storification. But both of their conceptions deal with a semantic framework based on more or less clearly defined ontological entities. In music, those entities are often less delineated. I will talk about that a bit later. Let us now focus on the applicability of Flodenick's model and concepts to the narratological study of music. The aim here is to study musical experience with the input of narratology without it becoming a metaphor of music as narrative, as a narrative, themes as characters, etc. Flodenick defined narrativity as mediated experientiality. Can music fulfill this condition? The only way it could serve the mediation of experientiality, since it's neither a language nor a means of communication, is if it was indeed a means of mediation. One would quickly fall into this trap. Music is most evidently a medium, but I would like, again, to consider music from a phenomenological point of view. The supposed continuum between producer and receiver has no reality if it is not made up. It is a commodity for the musicologist, aiming for an objective analysis and a helping hand for the listener to attach what he hears to a human producer. But the musical experience is, again, always that of the listener, which may have absolutely nothing to do with that intended by the composer. Where does this leave us in terms of music and narrativity? Musical narrativity is not constituted by mediated experientiality, but by experientiality in itself. Whereas in literature, the use of semantic content language allows for experientiality and consciousness to be applied first and foremost through the text. In the case of music, the experience is always that of the listener, even if she can exteriorize it in some instances. I would agree that experientiality is really always founded on empathy and projection of self-experientiality. But whereas narrative literature presents the reader with clear-cut containers made to receive experientiality, the characters and narrators, for example, music does not, be it only because of convention and current cultural understanding. So how does one exteriorize experientiality in music? The concept of focalization comes in handy at this point. Milberg already used this concept in music, though it was subsumed under literary focalization and mistook the music phenomenon for a narrative. Flodenick allows for both external and internal focalization, that's viewpoints on non-human objects, and contends that within natural narratology this is handled by the telling versus experiencing frame and viewing frame, telling versus experiencing and viewing. It's interesting to know that given music is not compatible with the telling frame, as we discussed, focalization can only be internal in this perspective, whereas in Milberg it could only be external. In the case of music, the experiencing frame would allow the listener to narrativize music the way he experiences it, whereas the viewing frame would lead to the narrativization of an exteriorized experience. I used the concept of focalization to describe this centration of experientiality upon oneself, I call that ego-centered focalization, or another real or imagined being, hetero-centered focalization, or a system, exterior-centered focalization. But if one is to exteriorize his musical experience on an existent which belongs to the musical phenomenon, we must ask ourselves, can music be segmented beforehand? Can existence be defined so that music may be studied as a narrative? France's experiments show that by thematic pieces, for example, sonata forms, often perceived to present more than two themes. The themes perceived are variable amongst listener, which allows us to doubt the possibility to consider specific and changing ontological entities as actants or existents, in tonal music at least. We could also think about using Gestalt theory in order to segment a piece, as this would probably be closer to a basic segmentation by listeners. But this would be forgetting that listening modes have an influence on cognitive segmentation. We thus have to accept that entities common to all listeners cannot be clearly defined in any music. Even if this seems to be an existential problem for music narratology, it is not necessarily, because we can study what the listener makes of entities once he has defined them. A question now comes to mind. Even in the case of a segmentation of entities, in which space do these evolve? In acousmatic music, physical space is most often composed as a pregnant parameter. Thus, acousmatic music may allow delineated entities to evolve in physical space and keep their identity and unicity all along. I talked about abstract or independent diegesis to designate this phenomenon. In tonal music, if the main theme becomes a character, it can absolutely not evolve in physical space, given that no tonal music used physical space as a pregnant parameter of composition. In contemporary instrumental music, if a particular timbre, color, or density is ontologically defined, the problem stays the same in most cases. But this is not sufficient. What spaces allow for the experiential evolution of ontological entities? What allows the listener to imagine an entity as experiencing something? We enter the realms of parameter spaces. In tonal music, the main parameters are often pitch, beat, and even density and intensity. In contemporary music, diverse timbre parameters such as brightness, roughness, or spectral density have taken much more important place. The formal ordering of any of these parameters may allow the listener to consider the entities previously defined, previously segmented, as experiencing something that does not necessarily involve physical space. The question of pitch is a bit more complicated with that, but it's another question. This could be linked with the idea of mimesis. Flodonic underlines a limit to the narrativization process. Imposing narrativity on the text and concretizing the existence of a fictive world and consciousness reduces the metaphoric and philosophic potentials of the text. In the case of my natural narratology for music, this limit is weakened. The main difference with Flodonic's report is that listening strategies do not all aim for narrative recuperation, although most of them seem to at least include narrativizing, but experience-related recuperation. And it is by definition possible, but only possible, to make any and all narrativized phenomena into narratives. The processes of work towards metaphoric and philosophic perception constitute what are called semiotic narrativization processes, and those are the topic of a presentation next week in Belgium. Sorry about the latency. All along this paper, I tried to show that music was neither language nor means of communication, and even less of a narrative. However, considering narrativity not as an attribute of narratives, but as one of experientiation, music listening can be viewed as presenting narrativity. A review of Monica Flodonic's natural narratology allowed me to analyze which components were suitable for an adaptation to music. I'm going to put all of them. Sorry about that. I took the idea of narrativization to signify the recuperation via natural experiential parameters and processes. The concept of experientiality was detached from its mediateness because of the solely aesthetic nature of the listening experience and the absence of a predetermined segmentation of ontological entities, experiential entities. Although I coined focalization the centration of experientiality, whether on the listener himself or on any other constructed entity. Among the 4 forms of constituting consciousnesses offered by Flodonic, only 2 were found suitable for the analysis of music reception: viewing and experiencing. The first one was linked with the apprehension of physical space, so mainly acousmatic musics, while the second one was considered to rely on parameter spaces. I distinguish between diegesis in physical space and experiential mimesis in parameter spaces. Now that all that is said, what can this model be used for? Because it's pretty important. Musicological analysis of a piece of music cannot be done with this model in its current state, but the extension of it and the collection of reactions to some kinds of music may help us understand the basic rules of segmentation proper to each listening mode and widen the way towards a phenomenological, multidimensional aesthetic analysis. Furthermore, if listening modes are indeed categorized and confirmed, they could be taught to listeners. This is one of the key points of my future research. How can we teach acousmatic listening, acousmatic music listening to people so that they find a satisfactory experience in the listening of such works, or even in the listening of their everyday environment? What's more, how can we teach them that without having them make such music? All forms of musical experience could and probably should be the subject matter of psychophysiology, phenomenology, and musicology, all of which are integral parts of a natural narratology for music. Thank you.